My name is Sarah Calloway, and I'm 29 years old. What I'm about to tell you sounds like something a screenwriter dreamed up at 3 in the morning, but I was there. I lived every second of it, and it all came to a head on a rainy Thursday in November, when my stepmother sat across from me with two attorneys, a notary, and a stack of documents she fully expected me to sign without asking a single question. When someone spends 11 years making you feel like a guest in your own childhood home, they stop expecting you to fight back. They stop seeing you as a threat. That was my stepmother's first mistake. Her second was not knowing that my grandfather had spent the last year of his life making absolutely sure that when this moment came, and he always believed it would come, I would not be standing alone. Before I tell you exactly what happened inside that title company office, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if stories about holding your ground against the people who were supposed to protect you mean something to you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what was at stake and who these people really were before you can understand why what happened next was so devastating to them and so necessary for me. My father died when I was 18, pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the kind that gives you 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. I had just graduated high school. I had a college acceptance letter sitting on the kitchen counter. I had my whole life arranged in a neat little row, and then the phone rang and every single piece of it scattered. My mother had passed when I was 7, a car accident on a January highway. Black ice, no survivors. So when my father got his diagnosis, it was just the two of us sitting in that oncologist's office. Just him and me and a pamphlet about palliative care that neither of us could bring ourselves to read. My father had remarried 4 years before he got sick. Her name was Diane. She had 2 kids from her previous marriage, my stepbrother Tyler, who was 23 and lived 40 minutes away, and my stepsister Ashley, who was 19 and had moved back home after a semester of college she described as not the right fit. My father loved Diane. I genuinely believe that. He was lonely after years of raising me alone, and she was warm and attentive in ways that made him feel seen again. I respected that. I even liked her in the early years, before I understood what she was watching for. The house we lived in had belonged to my father's family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather built it. My grandfather grew up there. My father inherited it when my grandfather moved into a smaller place nearby at 72. It sat on 2 acres at the edge of a quiet neighborhood in western Pennsylvania. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a detached garage my grandfather had converted into a woodworking shop decades ago. It was not a mansion, but it was ours. It had always been ours. What I didn't know until much later was that the house and the money my father left behind, a modest life insurance policy, and a retirement account, had been carefully restructured in his final months. What I didn't know was that Diane had been paying close attention to those restructuring conversations. And what I didn't know, what none of us knew, except my grandfather and his attorney, was that my grandfather had been paying even closer attention to Diane. My grandfather's name was Walter Eugene Calloway, 78 years old, former civil engineer, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once in every area of his life. He had watched Diane move into that house. He had watched how she treated me before my father got sick, and how that treatment shifted once the diagnosis came. He had watched her become softer, more present, more deliberate in the way she positioned herself in my father's life during those final months. And he had said nothing, not to me, not to my father, not to anyone. Because my grandfather understood something I was still too young and too grief-stricken to see. He was watching her show her hand. My father passed on a Tuesday in March. He was 51 years old. I held his hand. Diane stood on the other side of the bed, and in the weeks that followed, I watched the house I grew up in begin to change in ways I couldn't quite name. Photos of my mother came down from the hallway. My father's woodworking tools disappeared from the garage. Tyler started staying over on weekends. Ashley claimed the bedroom across from mine and began referring to it as her room, not the guest room, her room. Small things. The kind of things that feel petty to say out loud but accumulate quietly. like water damage. Until one day you notice the whole wall has rotted through. My grandfather called me every Sunday. He never asked about Diane directly. He asked about me, about school, about my plans. I had deferred my college enrollment for a year to stay close to home. He never told me that was a mistake. He just kept asking questions, listening carefully, and I can see now that he was building a picture from what I was telling him without even realizing I was doing it. He died 14 months after my father. A stroke, sudden, no warning. I got the call on a Friday afternoon. I drove to the hospital and sat with him for 2 hours before he slipped away. He was conscious for about 40 minutes of that, and in those 40 minutes he said 3 things to me that I held on to like rope. He said, "You are a Calloway, and that means something." He said, "Don't let anyone make you feel small in your own life." And then, near the end, he pressed a business card into my hand and said, "When they come for you, call Margaret first. She's been waiting." I didn't understand what he meant. I cried too hard to ask. The business card read, Margaret Voss, estate attorney. Voss and Kimball Associates. I put it in my wallet and forgot about it for 6 weeks. The call from Diane came on a Monday morning in October, 4 months after my grandfather's funeral. Her voice was the version she used when she wanted something, smooth and reasonable, with just enough warmth to make you feel like you were being invited rather than summoned. She said my grandfather had left some matters that needed to be settled and that she and Tyler had arranged a meeting with a property specialist to make everything clean and official. She used the word clean twice. She said it would be simple and that I should bring my ID. Something shifted in my stomach. I had lived in that house for 2 years since my father died. I had paid the utilities. I had kept up with the yard. I had done every single thing a person does when a place is theirs. But Diane's name was on the deed as my father's surviving spouse, and my grandfather's estate, as far as I knew, was separate and handled. I had never hired an attorney. I had never looked at documents. I had been 19 when my father died in grief blind, and no one had told me I needed to. I almost called Margaret Voss that morning. I almost listened to my grandfather. Instead, I went to the meeting. The office was in a commercial strip 20 minutes from the house. Clean beige carpeting, framed prints of landscapes, a receptionist who handed me a visitor badge without making eye contact. Diane was already seated at a conference table when I walked in. Tyler sat beside her, his shoulders squared in the way he did when he thought he was being impressive. There was a man to Diane's left I didn't recognize, 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a legal pad in front of him. There was another man across the table, younger, with a laptop open to something I couldn't see from the door. No one stood up. "Sarah." Diane smiled with her mouth. "Thanks for coming. Sit down." I sat. "This is Mr. Baxter," she said, nodding toward the man with the legal pad. "He specializes in estate transfers. And this is Mr. Park. He'll be handling the notarization, estate transfers." "What exactly are we transferring?" I asked. Tyler shifted. Diane kept smiling. "Your grandfather's assets included some property overlap with your father's estate," Mr. Baxter said. He had the measured cadence of someone who delivered uncomfortable news for a living. "Given the structure of the existing deed and the terms of survival, the cleanest path forward involves consolidating ownership under the primary heir." He slid a document across the table. "This is a quitclaim deed. It simply clarifies that you're releasing any informal claim to the family property in exchange for a one-time settlement." I looked at the number printed at the bottom of the page, $12,000. I looked up. "The house," I said slowly, "is worth over $300,000. "The house," Tyler said, his voice taking on an edge he didn't bother to hide, "has been in my mother's name since her dad died. You've been living there as a courtesy. Grandpa Walter's estate doesn't change that. It actually complicates it. Your grandfather left you some personal effects," Diane added quickly, the smoothness back in her voice. "His tools, some furniture, a few accounts. This settlement covers all of that and releases any ambiguity about the property going forward." Ambiguity. I thought about my grandfather's hands pressing that business card into mine. I thought about his voice, thin and careful, telling me they would come. "I need a few minutes," I said. Of course. Diane gestured to the door. Take your time. I walked into the hallway. I pulled out my wallet. The card was still there, bent at one corner, my grandfather's trust worn into the paper. Margaret Voss answered on the second ring. Ms. Voss, I said. My name is Sarah Calloway. My grandfather was Walter Calloway. He told me to call you. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, very calmly, I've been expecting your call for about 3 months. Where are you right now? When I told her the name of the title company, she was quiet for a moment. Don't sign anything, she said. Don't initial anything. Tell them you need to postpone. And then, Sarah, listen to me carefully. Go home. I'll be at your door in 2 hours. I went back into the conference room. I need to reschedule, I said. I'm not comfortable proceeding without reviewing everything with my own attorney. Tyler's jaw tightened. You don't have an attorney. I do now, I said, and I walked out. I've thought about that walk to my car many times since. How my hands were shaking and my chest felt like something was pressing against it from the inside. How I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I could drive. How I didn't know yet what my grandfather had done. Didn't know the scope of what Margaret Voss was about to show me. Didn't know that the woman I had just left sitting in a beige conference room had been planning this for 2 years while I was grieving and quiet and invisible. I found out later that Diane had contacted Mr. Baxter 6 weeks after my grandfather's death. I found out she had assumed, reasonably from her perspective, that I had never thought to look at the actual estate documents. That I would see a number with 4 figures and a smooth explanation and feel lucky. I found out that Tyler had been coaching her. That he'd researched quitclaim deeds online. That Ashley had told him, she'll just sign it, she always does what she's told. They did not know about Margaret. Nobody had told them about Margaret. Margaret Voss was 63 years old, a former litigation attorney who had moved into estate law 30 years ago after a career in the courtroom. She arrived at my door exactly 1 hour and 50 minutes after I called her, wearing a gray blazer and carrying a briefcase that looked older than I was. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table I had eaten breakfast at every morning for 11 years. And she opened that briefcase and showed me what my grandfather had spent his final year building. The first document was a trust, not a simple will, an irrevocable trust, established 14 months before my grandfather died, 1 month after my father's funeral. My grandfather had transferred the family property, the original deed, the one predating my father and Diane entirely, into a trust with my name as the sole beneficiary. Because the property had passed from my great-grandfather to my grandfather and then been loaned to my father, never legally transferred outright, Diane's spousal claim applied only to what my father personally owned, not to what my grandfather held in trust. The house, Margaret explained, had never fully been my father's to give. It had always been my grandfather's to protect. I stared at that document for a long time. She didn't know, I said. No, Margaret said. Your grandfather was very careful about what he disclosed and when. The second document was a video. Margaret set her laptop on the table and pressed play. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was sitting in Margaret's conference room, a date stamp in the corner, 11 months ago. His voice was clear and steady. My name is Walter Eugene Calloway, he said. I am of sound mind and I am making this statement of my own free will. He looked directly at the camera. I have watched my daughter-in-law Diane Calloway carefully over the past 2 years. I have watched how she treated my granddaughter Sarah before my son became ill, and how that treatment changed once his prognosis was confirmed. He paused. I am not a man who accuses without evidence, so I gathered some. He reached off screen and placed a folder on the table in front of him. In March of last year, Diane asked my son to add her name to the property deed as a co-owner. He declined. In July, she asked again, this time framing it as estate planning for Sarah's benefit. He declined again. My grandfather's voice was even unhurried. In September, 4 weeks before my son died, she had a document prepared by a notary in Westfield that listed her as co-trustee of his personal accounts. My son signed it. He was on heavy medication. He had 3 weeks to live. He looked at the camera. I do not believe he understood what he was signing. I had to pause the video. I sat in my kitchen and I breathed through my nose until I could see straight. Margaret didn't say anything. She just waited. When I pressed play again, my grandfather continued. I have also learned, through a conversation with my son's former financial advisor, that Diane contacted that advisor 2 months before my son's diagnosis to ask, hypothetically, what a surviving spouse would be entitled to in the event of death without a fully executed estate plan. He picked up the folder. That inquiry was dated 8 months before he was diagnosed. 8 months. I stopped the video again. Margaret let me sit with that for a minute. She asked before he was sick, I said. Before he was diagnosed, Margaret said quietly. We have no way to know when she knew. I don't know how to describe what that feels like. To hear something that reshapes 11 years of memory. Every Christmas dinner, every family vacation, every soft word and patient smile running through a new filter. I am not saying she didn't love my father. I am saying love and calculation are not mutually exclusive, and my grandfather had understood that long before I did. There's more, Margaret said. The third document was the one my grandfather called his contingency plan. It was a provision attached to the trust that activated automatically under one specific condition: if any party attempted to legally contest the trust, pressure me into surrendering my interest, or use fraudulent or coercive means to acquire the property, or any associated assets, the trust would redirect 20% of its holdings to a legal defense fund in my name, and all documentation gathered by my grandfather would be turned over to the county district attorney's office for review. The documentation included the notarized account document from the month before my father's death, the one Diane had prepared, the one my grandfather believed his son had not fully understood when he signed it. That's potential fraud, I said. That's potential fraud, Margaret confirmed. I want to be honest with you about what I felt sitting at that kitchen table. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired and sad and like I had been standing in a room for 11 years, not realizing the walls were made of paper. I felt the grief of my father all over again, not just for losing him but for what had been happening around him while he was trying to stay alive. I felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere in the specific territory between the two. And then I thought about Tyler saying, "She'll just sign it. She always does what she's told." I picked up my phone and I called Diane. "I'd like to reschedule," I said. "Same location, Friday at 10. I'll be bringing my attorney." There was a pause. "Your attorney?" "Margaret Voss," I said. "Of Voss and Kimball Associates. You might want to let Mr. Baxter know." She hung up without responding. Friday arrived cold and gray, the kind of November morning that feels like the sky is pressing down on everything. Margaret and I walked into the title company together. She was carrying the briefcase. I was carrying a coffee and more composure than I expected. Diane and Tyler were already there. Ashley had apparently decided not to come, which, given what happened next, turned out to be a mercy for her. Mr. Baxter was back. Mr. Park, the notary, was not. In his place was a second attorney I didn't recognize, younger, who introduced himself as a colleague of Mr. Baxter's and barely looked at me when he said it. Margaret set her briefcase on the table and sat down like she'd been sitting in rooms like this for 40 years, which she had. "I understand we're here to discuss the estate," she said pleasantly. Mr. Baxter cleared his throat. "We're here to finalize the quitclaim deed and the associated settlement. The terms are the same as presented Monday." "They're not," Margaret said. Silence. She opened her briefcase and placed a single document on the table. "This is the original trust deed establishing Walter Calloway as trustee and Sarah Calloway as sole beneficiary of the property at 44 Birchwood Drive, recorded in Allegheny County 18 months ago." She slid it to Mr. Baxter. "The property was never part of your client's husband's estate because it was never fully in his name. The deed transfer was conditional and revocable, and Mr. Calloway exercised his right to revoke it before his death." Mr. Baxter picked up the document. His face did something careful and complicated. Diane leaned forward. "Walter wasn't in his right mind near the end. He was on medications, he was confused, he wasn't. He was evaluated by 2 independent physicians 10 days before this document was recorded, Margaret said. She produced a second document. Both certify complete cognitive competence. One of them is the chief of geriatric medicine at Allegheny General. I have their signed affidavits. Tyler looked at his mother. Something was shifting in the room and he could feel it. Even if the trust is valid, Mr. Baxter said, choosing his words with visible care now. My client has a claim to the estate assets through spousal succession. We're prepared to argue that the trust was executed in a way that deliberately circumvented before you finish that sentence, Margaret said. I want to make sure you've been fully briefed by your client. She looked at Diane directly. Has she told you about the document she had prepared in September 3 years ago? The one that listed her as co-trustee of her husband's personal accounts, signed 4 weeks before his death while he was on hospice-level medication management? Mr. Baxter stopped. Has she told you that she contacted her husband's financial advisor 8 months before his cancer diagnosis to discuss spousal inheritance rights? Mr. Baxter looked at Diane. Diane looked at the table. Because if she hasn't, Margaret continued, then you're not fully informed about the risk exposure here. And if she has, then we have a different conversation to have about the ethics of what you've been asked to do. The younger attorney closed his laptop. Diane's composure, the thing she had been managing so carefully since I'd walked in, finally cracked along its seams. I loved my husband, she said, and her voice was raw in a way that might have been genuine. I don't know. I genuinely don't. I spent 3 years of my life caring for him. I watched him die. I have been living in that house, taking care of it, paying taxes on it. The taxes have been paid by the trust, Margaret said. She placed another document on the table. Automatically, through an account established for that purpose, you've been living in the property, Diane. Sarah has been paying for it. I had not known that. I felt it move through me like cold water. Tyler stood up. This is insane. You're trying to take our mother's home. It has never been your mother's home, Margaret said. She wasn't unkind about it. She was simply precise. It was Walter Calloway's home, and before that, it was his father's, and Walter Calloway chose to leave it to Sarah. You're welcome to challenge that in court, but I want you to understand clearly what triggering a legal challenge activates. She produced the final document, the contingency provision. She read the relevant section aloud in the same calm conversational tone she had used for everything else. The legal defense fund. The district attorney referral. The documents pertaining to the co-trustee paperwork and when it had been prepared and the circumstances under which it had been signed. The room was very quiet. Mr. Baxter leaned over and said something to Diane in a low voice. She shook her head. He said it again. She looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at me, and it was the first time in 11 years that I saw something in his face that wasn't contempt or indifference. I don't know what it was exactly. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of a person who has just understood they were wrong about how a story ends. I had promised myself I wouldn't speak unless I had to. But there was something I needed to say before we left that room. I want you to know, I said. And my voice was steadier than I expected. That I never wanted this to be a fight. I lived in that house for 11 years. I set the table for family dinners. I drove Ashley to her SAT prep because you asked me to. I sat in the waiting room every single time my dad had chemo because he needed someone there. I looked at Diane. You told me once that you thought of me as your own. I was 14. I believed you. I paused. I'm not angry at you for wanting security. I understand that. But what you did to my father in those last weeks, and what you tried to do to me on Monday, those things are not something I can just set aside and call family. Diane said nothing. I'm not filing anything with the district attorney, I said. That's not what this is. But I am moving back into that house and I am not signing a quitclaim deed. And I am not accepting $12,000 for my family's home. Margaret placed a new document on the table. A cease and desist, clean and final, prohibiting any further action toward the property or the estate assets. Diane picked up the pen and held it without moving for a long moment. Then she signed. Tyler signed beneath her, his jaw tight, without looking up. They left without another word. Mr. Baxter gathered his papers and paused at the door long enough to say, to Margaret rather than to me, I wasn't fully briefed. Margaret nodded once. He left. Margaret and I sat in the empty conference room for a few minutes. Outside, rain had started. I could hear it against the window. He really planned all of this, I said. He started planning the week after your father's funeral, she said. He told me he didn't want you spending a single year of your life feeling like you had to fight to belong somewhere. She closed her briefcase. He also left a letter. He asked me to give it to you after. The envelope had my name on it in his handwriting. Inside was a single index card, the kind he used for project notes in his engineering days, covered in his neat, small print. Sarah. The house is yours because it was always yours. I'm sorry I didn't say more out loud when I could. Some people show love with words. I showed it with preparation. Take care of the porch. The boards on the left side have always been soft. I love you, Grandpa. I am not going to pretend the months that followed were simple. Moving back into a house that had been someone else's version of home for 2 years takes time and intention. I repainted the kitchen. I cleaned out the garage. I found my grandfather's woodworking tools in a storage unit Diane had rented, packed up without asking. I brought them back to the workshop where they belonged. Diane moved into an apartment in the next town over. We have not spoken. Tyler texted me once, 4 months later, a message that said only, I'm sorry about how things went. I read it several times. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure what response would be true. Ashley called me in the spring. She was the one who surprised me most. She said she hadn't known about the quitclaim scheme until it was already in motion. That when she found out she had told Tyler it was wrong. That he had told her to stay out of it. She cried on the phone. The kind of crying that doesn't have a performance in it. I told her I believed her. I think I do. I now live in the house on Birchwood Drive. I work 30 minutes away, and I come home to the porch and the old oak in the yard and the woodworking shop where my grandfather taught me how to make a mortise joint when I was 12. I have repaired the softboards on the left side of the porch. He would have approved of the materials I chose. The life insurance settlement from my grandfather's estate. A portion of the trust Margaret had not even shown me that first night because I was already overwhelmed, sat in an account for almost a year while I figured out what to do with it. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to do something real. I used it to establish a scholarship fund at the community college in our county. It covers tuition, books, and a small living stipend for students who aged out of foster care. Students who turned 18 and found themselves suddenly responsible for everything with no one standing behind them. Students who know exactly what it feels like to not be quite sure where they belong. The fund is called the Walter Calloway Scholarship. The application asks one question beyond the standard ones. Describe someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself. I read every essay. At the first award ceremony, a 19-year-old named Marcus stood up to give a short thank you speech. He had aged out of 3 different foster placements. He was studying electrical engineering. He said, I used to think support was something other people's families gave them. I'm starting to understand it can come from places you didn't expect. I thought about my grandfather pressing a business card into my hand in a hospital room. I thought about all the ways love can look like preparation. I thought about how the most important things he ever taught me were not things he said, but things he quietly made sure I would have. There are people who will tell you that fighting for what's yours is selfish, that wanting what was left to you by someone who loved you is greed. There are people who will use the word family like a key that opens doors they haven't earned. I spent too many years believing that being quiet and grateful and invisible was the same thing as being good. It isn't. It never was. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to call the attorney. You are allowed to walk into a room where people are waiting to minimize you and say, very calmly, I'm not signing anything today. And sometimes the people who love you best are the ones who planned for the moment you finally understand that. Thank you for listening to my story. If it helped you feel less alone, or reminded you that standing up for yourself is not the same as starting a fight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about finding your ground when the people around you are trying to shift it. And leave me a comment. Have you ever had someone plan ahead for you in a way you didn't discover until you needed it most? I read every single response. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve the space you're standing in.